Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of History Quest. Today we're out in the cold winter in the snow at Piepenburg Park, one of McLeod County's county parks. And we're going to do a little history of these snowshoes. So stay tuned for some stories and some snowshoeing stuff. All right, so our first story today is actually a little history about what we're doing right here, snowshoeing. The first settlers, when they came to Minnesota, they found fast that if you want to get around in the winter, you're going to need a good pair of snowshoes. Now, of course, they didn't look like this. They were typically made out of wood and rawhide. Often they were traded for with the natives, or they were actually easy enough to just build themselves a pair. But with the snowshoes, they could get out, they could move around, they could get water from the rivers, they could go hunting, they could get on the lakes to go fishing. So snowshoes were really almost a mandatory item that somebody would need if they were going to settle in Minnesota. And of course, the history goes way back, 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, when snowshoes were first used. However, they were kind of perfected actually in North America by the Native Americans, who, especially the ones in Minnesota here, the Ojibwa, and then farther east, the Algonquins and Hurons. They developed a better snowshoe, a narrower snowshoe, longer snowshoe, or they had the beaver tail snowshoes that were really wide and really kind of short. But those are kind of where our classic images of the snowshoes come from. So at any rate, let's get on with that story, and we'll move on to the next one afterwards. Living in Minnesota can be a great thing if you didn't know. We love our lakes, our summers are splendid, and our autumn season is filled with breathtakingly beautiful scenes. For those living in the land of 10,000 lakes, however, there is one season that stands out above the rest: winter, a season that is synonymous with Minnesota. Our winters are cold, icy, and often riddle us with deep snow. Today we have several coping mechanisms that help us deal with the North Country winter: four-wheel drive, snow blowers, and a warm place to come home to. A look back in history, however, shows that it wasn't always this way. Prior to modern times, the people living in what is today Minnesota had to be tough individuals. Keeping warm and keeping fed in a world locked tight with snow and ice was no easy task. Perhaps most important of all, being able to be mobile was a key to survival. And for that, many looked to the one thing that could aid them in traversing the countryside in deep snow: the snowshoe. The origin and age of snowshoes are not precisely known, although historians believe they were invented from 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. Before people built snowshoes, nature provided examples. Several animals, most notable the snowshoe hare, had evolved over the years with oversized feet, enabling them to move more quickly through deep snow. The traditional web snowshoe as we know it today had direct origins to North American indigenous people. Samuel de Champlain wrote, referencing the Huron and Algonquin First Nations, in his travel memoirs, quote, "Winter, when there is much snow, the Indians make a kind of snowshoe that are 2 to 3 times larger than those in France, that they tie to their feet and thus go on the snow without sinking into it. Otherwise, they would not be able to hunt or go from one location to the other." End quote. The indigenous people of North America developed the most advanced and diverse snowshoes prior to the 20th century. Different shapes were adapted to the different conditions in each region. Despite their great diversity in form, snowshoes were, in fact, one of the few cultural elements common to all tribes that lived where winters were snowy. In particular, the northern regions. Nearly every indigenous peoples of the Americas cultures developed its own particular shape of the shoe. North American type snowshoes were slowly adopted by Europeans during early colonialism in what later became Canada and the United States. The French voyageurs and the coureurs de bois began to travel throughout the land of the Cree, Huron, the Algonquin groups of indigenous North Americans in the late 17th century to trap animals and trade goods. In order to travel effectively in the terrain and climate, they utilized the tools of the native populations, such as snowshoes and canoes. Snowshoes became popular during the French and Indian Wars, during conflicts such as the Battle on Snowshoes, when both the French, Indian, and British factions wore snowshoes to battle above a reported 4 feet of snow. When settlers began coming to Minnesota in the 1850s, they discovered fast the need for a good pair of snowshoes. Snowshoes meant that even in deep snow, people could still hunt and could still travel. Often, snowshoes were traded for, yet the shoes were simply enough to be made by oneself if need be. Today, snowshoeing has become much more of a recreational activity, the tool itself being more of a quote-unquote toy than tool. But be that as it may, there's no ignoring the fact that one of the greatest activities in the North Country has its roots buried deep into the past. And like so many other things, they are a key part of our history. All right, our next story is about a McLeod County pioneer named Isaac Cummings. He came back in the 1850s and experienced all those things the pioneers of that time experienced, and that's pretty straightforward, so enjoy.
History is filled with great people who have done great things. Locally, we often hear of the names like Martin McLeod, the Hutchinson brothers, or Alonzo Brown, people who played roles in founding the communities within the county. Though our founders are well worth remembering, they often overshadow the other people who settled the area in the early years. They too played important roles in the story of the county and their respective communities. In some ways, it could be argued that they were just as, if not more important than the pillars who came and founded the towns. Such is the case with an early McLeod County settler named Isaac W. Cummings. Cummings was born on April 18, 1825, at Gray's Corner, Maine. The Cummings name had been alive in the state for many years, and they were some of the earliest colonists there. Isaac was educated in Mechanics Falls, Maine, and resided there until he was 16 years old. As he grew, the young Mr. Cummings entered into the railroad business for much of his life. He was married in 1851, and they had 2 children. By the mid-1850s, Isaac and his family were residing in Canada. Like many, Isaac suffered from age, a recurring sickness that is linked to malaria and the flu. It was advertised that few people in Minnesota suffered from the sickness. As a result, the Cummings family uprooted themselves and moved south to Minnesota. Being a railroad man, Isaac Cummings had no experience in farming, but that didn't stop him from attempting to live off the land. He, along with his brother, traveled to the United States via the St. Lawrence Seaway. They traveled by water as far as they could before taking to land and traveling across the country until they came to a steamer traveling down the Mississippi to Fort Snelling. They, of course, hitched a ride. From Fort Snelling, they rode a stage to the edge of the Big Woods, then went on foot to Glencoe. Cummings' initial impression of the land was that it was sparse. Glencoe was little more than a few log cabins situated among a village of Dakota natives and their temporary lodges, teepees. There were no children and only 2 women living in the settlement. Once settled in, Isaac headed back to Quebec to collect his family and bring them to their new home on the frontier. Unfortunately, Isaac's wife, Eliza Cummings, died of typhoid fever. She was the first death of the community. Isaac quickly remarried a woman named Mary Buck and had more children. To supplement his earnings, Mr. Cummings delivered mail between Glencoe and Henderson. He was engaged in this work when he was first made aware of the Indian attacks against the settlers in 1862. This did not deter Isaac, however, and he continued to tend to his farm as well as deliver the mail until Hutchinson was attacked by Little Crow and his warriors in September of that same year. After the attack, Isaac removed his family to Minneapolis, yet he returned home to continue working. He moved from the area near his family later that year. While living in Minneapolis, Isaac took employment with the Cedar Valley Railroad and remained with them for 2 years. He then took up employment with the Manitoba Railroad Company and worked for them until 1867, when he and his family finally returned to their land in Glencoe. By the 1860s, log cabins were springing up all over the Glencoe area, especially near Buffalo Creek. The community then, in addition to a myriad of trade and shops, had a post office, a schoolhouse, a church, a courthouse, a general store, and a shoe store. It was much farther along than the little community that the family fled just 5 years prior. Life in the settlement was still difficult following the war years. The winter of 1867-68 was a tough one. To make matters worse, the region became infested with potato bugs and many crops failed. People survived on venison, potatoes, cornmeal, and salted buffalo fish. Life in the region eventually eased up from the subsistence lifestyle of the early settlers. Yet hard winters, locusts, and financial hardships still created many obstacles. In the case of Isaac Cummings, he, his children, and his wife lived out the remaining years to a ripe old age. Mary Buck Cummings passed away in 1898. Isaac lived a few years longer. He died in 1907 in Glencoe and was laid to rest in the Glencoe City Cemetery.
All right, our next story is about Glencoe, more specifically just the early years in Glencoe. As a matter of fact, right now, the Historic Preservation Society in Glencoe, which is kind of like their town historical society or historical organization, is rewriting the history book. They had a history book came out in the 1970s, and they're just trying to update it, add new things, and just change it around and make it a little bit more informative and, just as interesting. At any rate, I thought to kind of piggyback on that a little bit, we would do a little bit of Glencoe history just to kind of show what life was like in our county seat in the early years.
History certainly is a wonderful thing. The stories, the people, and the places all return to life for a brief moment when we take a little time to explore the past, especially when it took place right in our backyards. Here in McLeod County, we are lucky to have a well-documented past to learn from and to build on. With that in mind, it always amazes me how many things we can discover in the present to add to the illustrious story that is our history. A perfect example of this is the Glencoe Preservation Society, where a group of history enthusiasts have been combing through collected history to better understand, better interpret, and add to the story of how Glencoe came to be. I can't say for sure when their project will be finished, but I can offer a little insight into what the early years were like for McLeod County's first community. Glencoe was first laid out and settled in 1855, but the story of how it came to be stretches back even farther. The future site of the town was once a regular stopping place for a Dakota leader, John Otherday, and his band. They were apt to camp along the banks of Buffalo Creek. It was there, in Otherday's camp, where Martin McLeod likely came across the site for the first time. The demographic landscape of Minnesota prior to 1855 was largely native, with pockets of small European American and mixed blood people. That demographic was fated to change in 1851, however, as Dakota leaders sold the bulk of their land to the United States. And in a matter of a few short years, the first flood of Euro-American immigrants began coming to central Minnesota. In the case of McLeod County, it was Martin McLeod leading a group of settlers and speculators to the former campsite of John Otherday, where they would lay the foundation of Glencoe. It didn't take long for people to settle in the surrounding area. Within a year, the community was joined by Hutchinson, Kaniska, the Grimshaw Settlement, Bear Creek, Lester Prairie, and Cedar City. By the end of 1857, the majority of McLeod County, albeit unsettled and mostly devoid of settlers, was under deed and title. The initial surge and spread of settlers in Glencoe and the rest of McLeod County in 1856 and 57 was short-lived. A severe winter in 1856-57 brought things to a rapid halt. For many settlers, it was their first taste of a Minnesota winter. Snow accumulated to 3 feet, and the high drifts made it nearly impossible to travel across. To make matters worse, spring came late and farmers suffered. In addition to the weather, there was the case of overexpansion and overspeculation. Speculators acquired large swaths of land intending to reap massive profits, but unfortunately, an economic depression known as the Panic of 1857 set banks to fail and spectators sitting with land that they could not sell. For those living in the area, money was non-existent and currency was based on bartering furs and any food source that could be processed, gathered, or hunted, and any service that could be offered. Later in 1857, a scourge of grasshoppers devoured vegetation and caused a food shortage. Lastly, a rumor of a large Indian attack planned on Glencoe was spreading around the region like wildfire. It turned out not to be true, but it didn't help speed up the flow of new immigrants to the area. The hard times of early Glencoe citizens began in 1857 and didn't really end until the Civil War was concluded. Young men in the area left homes and families to fight the Confederates in the South. Then, in 1862, the Dakota War, or Sioux Uprising, caused many settlers to flee the area and never return. The Glencoe residents that stayed behind banded together, created a home guard, and built a fort named Fort Skedaddle, aptly named as it was the stopping place for settlers looking to skedaddle out of McLeod County. As evident by over 150 years of growth, the initial hardships of Glencoe and McLeod County eventually ended and growth resumed. More hardships such as the grasshopper scourge of 1873 and 1876, the Great Depression, and 2 world wars would take their toll on the community. But, as every good Minnesotan knows, you must take the good with the bad.
All right, so our final story of this month is a little story about Martin McLeod and his trek across Minnesota. And actually, that's what gave us the snowshoe idea. McLeod and his group came from Canada, trekked all the way across Minnesota down into south central Minnesota. And their main mode of transportation was on snowshoes. And this is a 2-parter, so we'll get the first part today, and we'll get the second part next month with another fun winter activity to go along with it. Enjoy!
Minnesota's frontier was an unforgiving place. Of that there is no doubt. The low marshlands, the impenetrable woods, and the wide open prairie that sprawled across the state made for a formidable foe for any person to traverse or to live in. Be that as it may, people still immigrated to the land in hopes of building a better life in the North Country wilderness. The first big push of immigrants to the region came in the late 1850s, and there is no doubt that they had it rough. As unforgiving as the land was, however, those coming during the initial surge of immigration were entering a landscape that had already been somewhat tamed by the native population, as well as the fur merchants from Minnesota's territorial era. Some historians refer to the 1850s to the 1860s in Minnesota as an urban wilderness, a different landscape than what it was in the decades that preceded. When Martin McLeod came to Minnesota in 1837, he was entering a world far different than the one he left in 1860 upon his death. In 1837, Minnesota was part of the Missouri and Wisconsin territories. The United States had a limited presence in the region, and the majority demographic was native. When McLeod ventured to the area, he was most definitely entering an entirely different world. The journey brought him from the Red River Colony to St. Peter. Upon his death in 1860, his memoirs that were collected and revealed showed just how harsh the land really was. What follows are pieces from his diary. Wednesday, March 1st. Left encampment at sunrise. Found it exceedingly cold. Sleeping out after having been in the house for 2 months. Come 40 miles today. Arrived at a shanty where we found 14 persons, men, women, and children, without food. They had been living for 7 days with an occasional hare and a pheasant. Friday, March 3rd. Had a cold and stormy night. Unable to leave camp before 9 o'clock. Went ahead at 12 o'clock. When it changed to the north and brought with it a snowstorm which caught us on the prairie, many miles from shelter. March 7th. Last night excessively cold. Today, unable to leave camp. so stormy that it is impossible to see the distance of 10 yards on the plain. The distance of the next wood or place of encampment is more than 30 miles, which would endanger the lives of us should we attempt to cross the plain in the storm. March 13th. Passed a more comfortable night than we expected. Morning was miserable, having to creep out of our buffalo skins and dig to the plains to warm ourselves. No fire, no water, no breakfast. Took a small piece of frozen pemmican and a handful of snow. At the same time, walked as fast as we could for warmth. Soon after we started, a violent snowstorm came in. Our guide said we were lost, that we would all die. Friday, March 17th. A snowstorm came up that no pen can describe. Tried to make a fire. My matches were all wet. My hands were too cold to strike a spark with the flint and steel. What could be done? I must not perish, I said to myself. I then thought of my companions. Poor fellows, there could be no hope for them. I had all the blankets, buffalo robes, provisions, and etc. The dogs followed me in the storm. Having dug a hole in the snowbank, made a sort of shelter with my cloak and blanket, rolled myself in a blanket with a large buffalo robe. I was then completely wet through, for a shower of sleet accompanied the storm. It was then so cold that I feared much that I would perish during the night. Night came, the storm continued unabated. My situation was truly miserable. Companions and guide in all probability perished, myself in great danger of freezing also, and in a strange country some 100 miles from any trading post or settlement. Saturday, March 18th. Never was light more welcome to a mortal. At dawn I crept from my hole, and soon after heard cries. Fired 2 shots into the air, and soon after a guide came up. He had escaped death by making a fire, and being a native and a half-blood, his knowledge of the country and the dangers saved him. Mr. Pars, unfortunately, found with both legs and feet frozen.
McLeod would eventually reach his destination, but the hardships of the journey were far from over. Hard decisions would have to be made in the days to come, and life would hang in the balance. And for that, we'll talk about next time. All right, well, that is all the time we have for you this month. Stay tuned for next month. As promised, we're going to do another fun outdoor winter activity, and we're going to finish off with that Martin McLeod story. So thank you, everybody, for viewing in, and I hope to see you down at the McLeod County Historical Society sometime soon. For me, I'm going to see where this trail goes. This way. Okay.
He told us a story about a brave moose and a brave squirrel. And one day, the moose looked at the squirrel and said, "Gee, Rocky, watch me pull a rabbit out of my hat."